Welcome to Smart Reads in Minutes. Today, we're diving into Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke. Let's get started. Introduction: The problem. The introduction opens with a striking observation about modern society. We are drowning in pleasure. The world has shifted from an era of scarcity to one of unprecedented abundance, offering an endless array of rewarding stimuli: drugs, food, social media, video games, sex, shopping, and more. Lembke argues that this overabundance has created a society increasingly plagued by addiction and compulsive behaviors, even among those who don't fit the traditional mold of an addict. Lembke draws attention to a key scientific insight. Dopamine is the brain's universal currency for pleasure. Everything we find enjoyable, whether it's sugar, sex, or scrolling through Instagram, triggers the release of dopamine, reinforcing the behavior and increasing our desire for more. Scientists measure the addictive potential of any experience by tracking dopamine release in the brain's reward system. More dopamine means a stronger pull toward compulsive consumption. The second major neuroscientific discovery Lembke presents is that pleasure and pain are processed in the same part of the brain and operate as a balance. The more we tip the balance toward pleasure, the more the brain compensates by pushing back with pain, creating a cycle of craving, tolerance, and dependence. This explains why people often feel dissatisfied or empty after indulging in pleasurable activities. The relentless pursuit of dopamine-rich experiences, whether through drugs, social media, or even just constant entertainment, can tilt the brain's default state toward pain and discomfort. To illustrate this, Lembke references the moment of craving, that feeling of wanting more after finishing a pleasurable experience. Whether it's reaching for another piece of chocolate or hitting next episode on Netflix, the desire for more is a direct consequence of the brain's pleasure-pain balance attempting to recalibrate itself. The book's goal is to unpack the neuroscience behind this phenomenon while incorporating real-life stories of people battling addiction. Lembke believes that understanding addiction is crucial because, in some ways, we are all addicts now. Whether it's compulsively checking our phones or constantly seeking entertainment, everyone has some habit they wish they could control better. The introduction closes with a promise to offer practical strategies to regain balance using insights from both neuroscience and addiction recovery. Chapter 1: Our Masturbation Machines. Lembke introduces Jacob, a 60-year-old scientist who outwardly appears normal, polite, well-dressed, and successful. However, as she soon discovers, Jacob has spent decades battling a secret and escalating pornography and masturbation addiction. His story serves as an extreme example of how modern, dopamine-rich environments encourage compulsive behavior. Jacob's addiction began in early childhood, when he first discovered masturbation at the age of 2 or 3. He recalls having early sexual experiences that he couldn't fully understand, and as he grew older, he found himself increasingly drawn to self-stimulation. As a child, he masturbated regularly, sometimes with his best friend, but his Catholic upbringing instilled deep guilt. After his first communion, he was taught that masturbation was a mortal sin, forcing him to hide his habits and begin leading a double life, a theme Lembke identifies as central to addiction. Throughout his adolescence, Jacob ritualized his masturbation habits, using a drawing of the Greek goddess Aphrodite, which he hid beneath the floorboards. When he moved away for university, his addiction escalated due to increased privacy and loneliness. It was then that Jacob took a disturbing new step. He built a masturbation machine. Using a record player, a metal rod, and a cloth-wrapped coil, he engineered a device that could simulate pleasure for hours at a time. He adjusted the speed, combined the experience with cigarette smoking, and experimented with ways to prolong orgasm indefinitely. Lembke is initially disturbed but soon realizes that Jacob's story mirrors modern society's compulsive relationship with technology. She compares Jacob's masturbation machine to today's smartphones, video games, social media, and streaming services, which provide endless and customizable pleasure at our fingertips. Just like Jacob's device, modern dopamine-driven technologies offer users an artificial, highly stimulating escape, making them more appealing than real-life interactions. Jacob eventually abandoned his machine after getting married, believing that marriage and love would cure his addiction. But the real world, where pleasure is not as instantaneous or predictable, could not compete with his machine. When the internet arrived in the 1990s, he fell back into his old habits, this time with unlimited access to pornography and digital stimulation. The more he watched, the more extreme his tastes became, leading him to explore live shows, chat rooms, and even self-electrical stimulation. He discovered online communities dedicated to extreme pleasure seeking and began programming his machine to sync with porn videos, experiencing virtual reality-like pleasure. His addiction destroyed his marriage. He repeatedly promised his wife that he would stop, but he always relapsed. Eventually, his wife left him, following the advice of her therapist. At this point, Jacob became suicidal, recognizing that his pursuit of pleasure had become his prison. He came to Lemke seeking help, desperate to escape the cycle of pleasure-seeking and self-loathing. The chapter closes with Lemke's broader reflection. Jacob's story is not unique. In an era where every industry is designed to hijack dopamine, we are all at risk of falling into our own masturbation machines, whether it's endless scrolling, online shopping, or pornography. The lesson is clear. Unregulated pleasure eventually leads to suffering. Chapter 2: Running from Pain. Lemke shifts focus to another side of addiction, using drugs and behaviors to escape pain rather than seek pleasure. She introduces David, a 35-year-old man whose battle with addiction began in college when he was prescribed Adderall for ADHD and Paxil for anxiety. His story illustrates how modern medicine has contributed to addiction by overprescribing mood-altering medications for normal human discomfort. David's anxiety began in college when he struggled with public speaking and social interactions. Instead of helping him develop coping skills, doctors quickly diagnosed him with multiple disorders and prescribed medication. Adderall helped him focus, but over time, he built tolerance, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect. His dependence escalated, leading him to manipulate his doctors for more pills. He learned to time his refill requests, lie about lost prescriptions, and avoid doctors who might cut him off. Lemke uses David's story to critique modern medicine's obsession with erasing pain. Unlike in the past, when doctors viewed pain as a natural part of life, today's healthcare system treats all discomfort as pathological. This shift has led to mass opioid prescriptions, rising rates of antidepressant use, and an increasing number of people hooked on stimulants. David's story takes a darker turn when he begins mixing drugs to maintain equilibrium, Adderall to stay awake, Ambien to sleep, and Ativan to calm anxiety. His wife had no idea how dependent he had become. The cycle eventually wore him down to the point where he considered suicide. When he finally confessed his addiction, his wife was shocked by the number of pills he had hidden. He was hospitalized, detoxed, and diagnosed with substance use disorder. Lemke broadens the discussion to society at large. Why, in an age of wealth, convenience, and medical advances, are people more depressed and anxious than ever? She points to studies showing that rich countries have higher anxiety rates than poorer ones, and that mental health issues are rising worldwide. The chapter concludes with a paradox. By trying to eliminate pain entirely, we have made ourselves more fragile. Chapter 3: The Pleasure-Pain Balance. Lemke delves into the neuroscience of pleasure and pain, explaining how the brain's reward system operates and why excessive pleasure-seeking inevitably leads to suffering. She introduces dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, reward, and pleasure. While dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, it plays a dominant role in driving behavior and determining addiction potential. Scientists have discovered that the amount of dopamine released in the brain's reward system correlates with how addictive a substance or activity is. For example, chocolate increases dopamine levels by about 55%, sex by 100%, nicotine by 150%, cocaine by 225%, and methamphetamine by 1,000%. meaning that one hit of methamphetamine provides the brain with a dopamine surge equal to 10 orgasms. These numbers illustrate why certain drugs and behaviors quickly lead to compulsive use. A key neuroscientific breakthrough, Lemke explains, is the discovery that pleasure and pain are processed in the same part of the brain and function as a balance system. She asked the reader to imagine a balance scale in the brain. When we engage in pleasurable activities, the balance tilts to the side of pleasure, releasing dopamine. However, the brain automatically compensates by pushing back with an equal and opposite force toward pain. This is its way of maintaining homeostasis, biological equilibrium. The greater the pleasure, the greater the pain response that follows. This explains why we experience come-downs after a high, why eating too much sugar leads to cravings, and why binging on social media or video games results in dissatisfaction once we stop. The more frequently we tip the scale toward pleasure, the more the brain adjusts by increasing the pain response, making it harder to feel joy from normal, everyday experiences. Lemke introduces the concept of tolerance, where repeated exposure to high dopamine activities weakens the pleasure response and strengthens the pain response. With time, people find that they need more of the substance or behavior to achieve the same effect, and eventually, even large amounts fail to provide satisfaction. She uses opioid-induced hyperalgesia as a compelling example. Patients prescribed opioids for chronic pain often develop increased pain sensitivity because the brain adapts by overcompensating with a pain response. In the same way, compulsive video gamers or social media users may find that, over time, these activities no longer bring the same level of enjoyment, but they continue engaging in them compulsively to avoid the discomfort of stopping. This, Lemke explains, is the essence of addiction, the compulsive pursuit of pleasure despite negative consequences. The chapter concludes with the troubling reality that many modern individuals live in a state of dopamine imbalance. Whether through substance use, social media, or food, people constantly seek stimulation, leading to a chronic state of pleasure-seeking and pain avoidance. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to experience happiness naturally, and the more people feel compelled to chase artificial highs. Lemke argues that the key to breaking this cycle is to stop flooding the brain with dopamine and allow the pleasure-pain balance to reset. She hints that future chapters will explore how intentional discomfort and self-restraint can help individuals regain control over their reward system and restore their capacity for natural joy and contentment. Chapter 4. Dopamine Fasting. This chapter introduces the concept of dopamine fasting, a strategy designed to help individuals reset their brain's reward system and restore homeostasis in an age of overstimulation. Lemke begins by introducing Delilah, a teenage patient whose parents forced her into therapy due to her excessive marijuana use. Delilah believes that her real problem is anxiety, not addiction. She uses high-potency cannabis concentrates daily, starting in the morning and continuing throughout the day, convinced that smoking is the only way she can function. Through her case, Lemke highlights a common issue. Many people engage in compulsive behaviors not for pleasure alone, but as a way to self-medicate underlying emotional distress. Lemke explains that dopamine fasting is a way to reset the brain's reward threshold by abstaining from a highly stimulating substance or activity for a certain period. She presents the DOPAMINE framework, a structured approach to self-regulation. The first step, D for data, involves tracking consumption to gain awareness of patterns. O for objectives asks patients to define their goals. Do they want to quit entirely or simply reduce their use? P for problems requires identifying the negative consequences of compulsive behaviors. Delilah, for example, experiences worsening anxiety, social isolation, and declining motivation due to her cannabis dependence. The most critical step is A for abstinence, which Lemke argues is necessary to allow the brain to recover from dopamine overload. She advises patients to take a 4-week break from their addictive behavior, explaining that this period is necessary to allow the brain's pleasure-pain balance to reset. She draws from brain imaging studies showing that dopamine transmission remains below normal levels even 2 weeks after quitting a substance. Delilah initially resists the idea of quitting, but when Lemke asks her if she still wants to be using cannabis in 5 or 10 years, she hesitates. The realization that she does not want to be dependent forever motivates her to commit to a dopamine fast. The later steps of the framework focus on M for mindfulness, which encourages individuals to observe their cravings without acting on them. I for insight involves reflecting on how addiction developed in the first place, while N for next steps and E for experiment guide patients in figuring out whether they should maintain complete abstinence or attempt moderation. Lemke acknowledges that moderation is often unrealistic for individuals with severe addiction, as reintroducing their drug of choice can trigger a rapid return to compulsive behavior. By the end of the chapter, Delilah has committed to trying 1 month of abstinence, taking the first step toward regaining control. Chapter 5. Space, Time, and Meaning. In this chapter, Lemke expands on the idea of self-binding, which involves intentionally creating barriers between oneself and addictive behaviors. She revisits Jacob, the scientist with a pornography and masturbation addiction, who successfully abstained from his compulsive behavior for a year, but eventually relapsed during a stressful trip to Eastern Europe. His trigger was something as simple as turning on the hotel television, which led him down a familiar path, first flipping through channels, then watching YouTube videos, and eventually rebuilding his masturbation machine. This relapse illustrates how minor exposures to high dopamine stimuli can reignite addiction even after long periods of abstinence. Lemke categorizes self-binding strategies into 3 key areas: space, time, and meaning. Space-based self-binding involves physically removing access to addictive triggers. For example, Jacob's recovery was partly successful because he had kept himself away from environments that encouraged relapse. He later realizes that removing the television from his hotel room might have helped prevent his downward spiral. Other examples include people who delete social media apps, keep their phones in another room while working, or physically distance themselves from high-risk environments. Time-based self-binding focuses on restricting access to addictive behaviors to specific time windows. Lemke discusses intermittent fasting as an example of time-based restraint, where individuals limit their eating to certain hours of the day. Similarly, people addicted to social media or video games can try restricting use to certain time blocks rather than engaging compulsively throughout the day. She highlights research showing that delaying gratification improves self-control, referencing studies on the Stanford marshmallow experiment, which found that children who resisted immediate rewards tended to have better long-term outcomes in life. The third category, meaning-based self-binding, is about finding purpose and deeper fulfillment to replace compulsive behaviors. Lemke argues that many addictions arise from a lack of meaningful engagement in life, leading people to seek quick dopamine fixes as a substitute. She discusses how art, spirituality, relationships, and physical activity can help individuals create new sources of satisfaction. For instance, Jacob finds that focusing on his work and relationships helps fill the void left by his compulsive behaviors. However, relapse often occurs when stress, boredom, or emotional pain resurface, making it essential to maintain long-term strategies for balance. The chapter concludes with the idea that modern life makes it harder to implement self-binding, as we live in a culture of instant gratification, but these strategies remain essential for preventing relapse and regaining control. Chapter 6. A Broken Balance? This chapter explores what happens when the pleasure-pain balance becomes chronically dysregulated, leading to long-term emotional suffering and an inability to experience joy. Lemke argues that modern society has pushed the limits of pleasure-seeking to the point where many people now live in a chronic dopamine deficit state. She revisits the neuroscience of addiction, emphasizing how prolonged exposure to high dopamine activities can cause long-lasting changes in the brain, making it harder to feel motivated or content without extreme stimulation. One of the key insights in this chapter is that not everyone starts with a level balance. People with depression, anxiety, or trauma often have a brain that is already tipped toward pain, making them more vulnerable to addiction. Lemke references historical research from World War II military Dr. Henry Beecher, who observed that badly wounded soldiers often reported little or no pain, while civilians with minor injuries experienced extreme suffering. This suggests that the perception of pain is influenced by context and meaning. In the modern world, where people have fewer existential struggles, they are more likely to fixate on small discomforts and seek immediate relief through addictive behaviors. Lemke introduces the concept of dopamine hijacking, where industries design products specifically to manipulate the brain's reward system. She discusses the rise of highly engineered foods, addictive social media algorithms, and endless entertainment, all of which train the brain to expect constant stimulation. Over time, the brain adapts by reducing its dopamine sensitivity, leading people to feel increasingly bored, restless, and unmotivated. This is why many individuals turn to more extreme forms of stimulation, whether through drugs, compulsive shopping, or binge watching. The chapter closes with a sobering conclusion. The human brain was not designed for an environment of constant excess. Evolution prepared us for scarcity, where pleasure was rare and survival required effort. Now that we live in a world of abundance, people must actively restrain themselves to maintain emotional stability. Lemke suggests that embracing pain and discomfort intentionally, whether through exercise, fasting, or discipline, may be the only way to restore balance. She teases the next section of the book, which will explore how leaning into pain can paradoxically lead to greater happiness and resilience. Chapter 7, Pressing on the Pain Side. In this chapter, Lemke explores the paradoxical idea that deliberately experiencing pain can restore the brain's balance and enhance well-being. She starts by introducing Michael, a patient who struggled with addiction but found relief through cold water immersion therapy. Michael was once heavily addicted to alcohol and cocaine, using substances to escape from the emotional and physical discomfort of daily life. His descent into addiction followed a familiar pattern. He chased pleasure in an attempt to numb his underlying pain, but over time, his brain adapted, requiring more substances to achieve the same high. Eventually, he found himself miserable, physically wrecked, and emotionally disconnected from life. Michael's turning point came when he started taking cold showers as a form of self-discipline. He initially hated the experience, but over time, he noticed that subjecting himself to controlled discomfort made him feel more alive. The cold showers eventually escalated into full ice baths, which he performed daily. Lemke explains the neuroscientific basis of why this worked. Just as excessive pleasure leads to pain, controlled pain triggers the body's natural pleasure response. The key mechanism at play is hormesis, a phenomenon in which exposure to mild stressors builds resilience and strengthens the body's ability to cope with future challenges. She cites historical examples of people using pain as a tool for transcendence, from religious ascetics practicing self-flagellation to extreme athletes who push their bodies to the limits. Scientific studies support this concept, showing that exposing oneself to brief, controlled pain, such as intense exercise, fasting, or ice baths, activates the brain's endogenous opioid system, leading to a surge of dopamine and endorphins. This natural high explains why many people find relief from anxiety, depression, and even addiction by engaging in difficult but rewarding activities. The chapter closes with Lemke's broader argument that modern society has made life too comfortable, leading to widespread dissatisfaction and addiction. She argues that reintroducing controlled discomfort into our lives, whether through exercise, fasting, or even simple acts of delayed gratification, can help restore balance to the brain's pleasure-pain system. Instead of constantly seeking comfort and running from pain, people must learn to lean into discomfort as a way to build resilience and experience deeper, more sustainable happiness. Chapter 8, Radical Honesty. Lemke shifts the discussion to the importance of truth-telling in overcoming addiction and compulsive behaviors. She argues that radical honesty, not just avoiding big lies, but eliminating even the smallest deceptions, can help individuals break free from addiction and live more authentic lives. She introduces Maria, a woman who struggled with alcohol addiction and had developed a deep-seated habit of lying, not just about her drinking, but about trivial things such as where she was going or what she had eaten for breakfast. Maria's story illustrates how dishonesty and addiction feed into each other, creating a cycle of shame, secrecy, and further consumption. Lemke explains that lying activates the brain's reward system in the same way that addictive substances do. It provides immediate relief from discomfort, whether that discomfort comes from avoiding consequences, saving face, or escaping an unpleasant truth. However, just like with substance abuse, the long-term cost of lying is immense. When people build their lives on deception, they lose the ability to form genuine, intimate connections, which are essential for mental well-being and addiction recovery. She explores the biological and evolutionary roots of deception, noting that humans, like many animals, have developed the ability to deceive as a survival strategy. However, while deception may have short-term advantages, it carries heavy long-term psychological consequences. Studies show that truthful people experience lower stress levels, stronger relationships, and better mental health overall. Neuroscientific research even suggests that practicing honesty strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for self-control, planning, and long-term thinking. Maria's turning point came when she forced herself to be radically honest, even when it was painful. One of her first tests was admitting to her brother that she had secretly opened his mail, an act she initially denied. The moment she told the truth, she felt an unexpected sense of liberation. Over time, she realized that truth-telling freed her from the mental burden of maintaining lies. She no longer had to keep track of her deceptions or live in fear of being exposed. Her relationships became deeper and more authentic, and she found that she could trust herself again. Lemke concludes by emphasizing that radical honesty is not just about overcoming addiction, it is a tool for living a better life. While lying provides temporary relief, honesty leads to long-term emotional freedom and stronger connections with others. She encourages readers to experiment with absolute truthfulness, even in small matters, to see how it transforms their self-perception and relationships. The act of telling the truth, no matter how painful, can be a powerful form of self-liberation. Chapter 9: Prosocial Shame. In this chapter, Lemke explores the role of shame in addiction and recovery, arguing that while shame can be destructive, it can also be a powerful force for change when handled correctly. She begins by distinguishing between destructive shame and prosocial shame. Destructive shame is the type of shame that isolates people, making them feel unworthy of love and connection. It drives addiction, secrecy, and self-hatred, trapping individuals in a cycle of compulsive behavior and deeper despair. To illustrate this, she introduces Lori, a woman who struggled with substance abuse and extreme self-loathing. Lori's addiction was fueled by her fear of rejection, which led her to lie, hide her struggles, and isolate herself from others. She eventually turned to her church for support, hoping to find acceptance. However, instead of embracing her, her church elders discouraged her from openly discussing her addiction, reinforcing her destructive shame. As a result, she withdrew even further, continuing to consume substances in secret. Lemke argues that prosocial shame, in contrast, is a constructive form of shame that encourages accountability and change. She highlights Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, as a model for prosocial shame, where members are expected to admit their mistakes but are not shunned or ostracized for relapsing. In AA, shame serves a positive function. It motivates individuals to own up to their actions, make amends, and reintegrate into a supportive community. Lemke shares the story of her mentor, a recovering alcoholic who experienced a profound moment of prosocial shame when his wife discovered he had been secretly drinking. Instead of rejecting him, his wife's look of disappointment and hurt gave him the motivation to seek treatment and join AA. Lemke argues that healthy communities use prosocial shame to enforce group norms without alienating members. She cites research showing that humans are wired to respond to social shame, as rejection from the group once meant a lower chance of survival. However, she warns that shame must be accompanied by a clear path to redemption. Without this, it simply deepens feelings of unworthiness and reinforces addiction. The chapter ends with a reflection on how families, workplaces, and social groups can implement pro-social shame to support accountability and personal growth. Instead of shunning or condemning people for their mistakes, communities should offer a structured path to reacceptance. Lemke emphasizes that shame is not inherently bad. It is only harmful when it leads to isolation rather than reintegration. By embracing pro-social shame, people struggling with addiction and compulsive behaviors can find motivation to change while still feeling valued and accepted. And that's a wrap on Dopamine Nation. I really appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and share. It really helps the channel grow. Even though I use AI for summaries, it still takes effort, and your support keeps this going. My goal is to get the channel monetized so I can keep bringing you more great audiobook summaries. If there's a book you'd like me to summarize next, let me know in the comments. See you in the next one, with much love and gratitude.